Hello, writers. Have you ever bought a writing craft book someone says you just have to read?
Is it still sitting on your shelf? Have you even cracked the spine?
That's totally me.
Don't ask Renee how many craft books she owns.
Why do we keep buying these books we never read?
We all want to improve as writers, but that's hard to do alone.
That's why we started the Words to Write By podcast, to tackle these books together chapter by chapter and learn from their advice.
Or not. Sometimes they're wrong.
Hi, I'm Renee Nelson, former college writing instructor turned full-time writer and podcaster. After many years, I finally have a complete draft of my memoir.
And I'm Kim Smuga-Otto, author of the humorous fantasy series Boy Bands and Dragons. The first book, Our Comeback Tour Slaying Monsters, will be released this year by Riverfolk Publishing.
And now, on with the podcast.
Hello, listeners. In a recent episode, we discussed some of the issues of writing about real people. And in the book we're covering, Judith Barrington's Writing the Memoir, she says, each of us must balance the reasons for writing a story against the harm that might be done to someone else. Sometimes that choice is not a difficult one to make. You believe that your story will be crucial to many readers, that any harm to others will be slight. But often it's harder to know what matters most, someone's livelihood or your need to tell the story. The importance of your story to many readers or one person's public humiliation. When you face these difficult choices, a good question to ask yourself is, which decision is more life-enhancing? And to speak to me about these ideas is our guest today.
Hi, I'm Joyce Hunter-Moss. I was born in the second oldest Amish community in the United States and grew up on the farm homestead. And so I have generations and generations of Amish and conservative Mennonite, Amish Mennonite within my background. However, I no longer am in it, but I do write poetry that discusses a lot of the good things, but then also a lot of the abuse that happens within the communities as well. And I currently am a Delaware Department of the Arts Individual Fellowship Grant winner for poetry this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So for our listeners that aren't familiar with the term plain people, could you give a quick overview?
The plain people are referred to as individuals. They usually come out of an Anabaptist history, the theological history. So you're looking at the Amish, more conservative sects of the Mennonites, some of the Hutterites, some of the more conservative Brethren. They have a very simple lifestyle. Most of the time you can recognize the women. They wear dresses at all times. Usually their hair is up with a covering on it. People call a lot of different things, but within the community, we call it a covering. And it's much about simplicity. Humility is huge, as well as a separation from the modern world. And then a lot of tradition that is within that. And so the separation from the world looks a lot of different ways. Some of the more progressive Amish will have phones for business now, but it's usually the men. You still have the traditional gender roles. And a lot of them used to be agrarian, but however, you're finding, since land is not that plentiful, that they're going into building. Some people will know the Amish made sticker that you find on a lot of furniture and things. So this is the tradition. It's a way of belief, but it's also very much a tradition.
And it's actually a very fast-growing population in the United States because they have a lot of children, correct?
Yes. So you will find in most of them, they do not have the usage of birth control, and they also believe children are a gift from God. And when you had a farm, you needed people to work the farm. And so there were 6 of us in my family. We were actually considered one of the smaller families. So my uncle had like 12, my other one had 9. And so the growth usually happens from within. You're not going to find too many people want to give up electricity and other things in order to come into the community. So it is growing and it's expanding out west where there's land that is more plentiful.
And one of the things about this community is that the children aren't baptized. You wait until you're a teenager or a young adult to make that decision. And so there are a large number of people that choose not to stay with this culture and lifestyle, of which you are one of them. And And so this kind of segues to your work and people that you have collaborated with and worked with who write about the stories of what it was like to grow up this way. Can you talk a little bit about why people might leave the community and why people that leave the community might want to tell their story?
So you'll find a lot, they do not do infant baptism. That was part of the Anabaptist, the Anna part. And you will hear stories a lot within the Amish about Rumspringa, where the youth go off and do their wild things and choose to join the church or not. However, that's not very traditional in most communities. Most of the time, you will find even people who leave have been baptized. And when you are baptized, that is also then when you join the church. And so at that point, you now come under what they call the ordnung, which is now, you have to wear the dress, you have to wear the covering. You've signed on to this. Some will leave who do Rumspringa, some will leave and not come back. But you find a lot of individuals who will wait until they're 21, which within those communities is when you're an adult. My dad knew I wasn't going to stay. My mom didn't want to face the fact, but I waited till I was 21 and then I left. You will find some individuals will leave it later on, especially now it's becoming more known the LGBTQ community are of course leaving because they're very anti-LGBTQ. And so some of them have been coming out recently lately as well, which is wonderful to see the freedom. But you find that you are so constricted within those communities. Even within marriage, you have the roles of the gender roles, you have expectations, and also then you find lots of abuse. And thankfully, I believe this next generation is talking more about that. And so it's a way of leaving and finding some freedom.
Part of that freedom is to tell the story of things that happened to you, and you write about your history and your choices in your poetry, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I was a child sexual abuse survivor by multiple individuals, more years than not, and most of them are within the community. You will find most of the time it is family members. You will find other times there's other individuals involved. However, within the playing community, sadly, there's a lot of familial child sexual abuse. And so I do address that within my writing as well, simply because I want to give voice not only to myself, but for the generations that came before me. We all have ancestry books, but we who have grown up within the playing community know they lie, and that you will not have necessarily the correct biological father listed because it would have been a brother to the mother. And so there's a lot of ancestral children within that community as well.
And how do you, not so much how directly do you address this, but like when you're planning to write about this, what questions do you ask yourself about how realistic or how identifiable your poetry is?
I've kind of always been a writer, but I did a lot of writing, journaling through my healing process. And when I started writing poetry, I had a good friend that is a good mentor, poet mentor as well. And I had written something one time and he was like, Joyce, I'm not sure what to do with this. He said, it's just so blatant. He goes, I get lost in feeling the emotions that I start to not even read the words. Like I'm missing the craft of poetry. We talked a lot about that. We talked about Emily Dickinson, who talks about coming at it slant. And so what I've done sometimes, if there's something that I specifically want to write about and I'm not sure what slant to take, I'll just write it out, just free thought, and just put it in my one folder. And then every once in a while, something will hit me and I'll be like, this is the angle I want to come at it. The name may have changed, or I just use a pronoun. The setting may change, but the emotions and the act of, there's a lot more showing than telling within the writing. And so you kind of weave a craft in and around it instead of just coming at it straightforward is what I've chosen, because I also want individuals to read it and not be triggered, not to be off put by it. I want the individuals within my community to be able to read it as well. They're not happy with me speaking up, but I'm not naming names. I am also recognizing the good that is within the community. It's something that you have to consider, especially within the playing community. You have a community mostly made up of survivors and abusers. And if you start naming one, it's like the first domino. So my writing is not as much to topple the dominoes. My writing is to stop putting up the dominoes close enough together and stop putting up dominoes all together so that education, awareness can get out, and then it will just stop. The survivors that I know that we are working together on are coming at it from a side of education. So we're coming at it slant to start the conversations within the community, and then to also bring to light that there are these dark shadows within the plain community that many people don't see. They like their Amish made furniture. They like the rom-coms or whatever, the Amish drama. And it's like, there's a whole other side that you're actually supporting by buying into this, because we find that police departments, social workers actually buy into that and do not actually listen to survivors and listen to those within the community. So it's very complicated. Misty Griffith, she has written a memoir, Tears of the Silent. She was able to also then help produce The Sins of the Amish. It was a documentary on, I believe it was Peacock, about 2 years ago. It can still be found probably on Netflix or something, and it gives a whole different side of the community. Working with her and talking with her a lot. And then also with Don Schwarzentruber is an Indiana Art Fellowship grant winner as well. And he's working on a graphic novel, and he is not a survivor per se. But one of the things that I'm working with him on is, as he says, he can't bring the mindset of an Amish or a Mennonite woman to what he's doing. And he wants to make sure that it's also somewhat palatable within the community so that they will read it. Because if you go into the revenge memoirs, if you go into something too much, you don't have the chance to educate. The door will be shut. And so we're trying to do that fine line of education on the inside and education on the outside.
You're not thinking about it like, I don't want to expose this person, or I do want to expose this person, but more like, I want my community to read these pieces and I want it to be palatable. So what kind of decisions specifically do you make, or do your collaborators make, to make these stories palatable but still be true and still carry the weight that you want them to carry?
I believe one of the biggest things is usually changing names within it. And you can give enough descriptors that it's fairly easy to know who you're speaking about. I remember speaking with Misty. She changed names and things, and she still got a lot of emails that said, give me an address, I'll go burn their barn down. For me, I don't want to specifically name people because I don't want outsiders exacting revenge that harms some of the innocents as well within that. And so I will change names or just use pronouns. I will usually change settings. I grew up deer hunting. I know that's a whole thing, but that was our meat in the winter. So instead of deer spotting, which is where a lot of my abuse used to happen, and those who live in Pennsylvania would understand that term. You go spot the deer so you know where to hunt. I changed it to it happening deer hunting. I also put in the metaphor of the woods and the different layers, used a lot of protective language, and use a lot of the settings so that the individual who reads this knows what is happening, feels the feeling, feels the emotions, but then they cannot point to a specific individual or a specific date where something happened. Within our communities, we know who has done what. It's not a secret. It's whispered about, and the generational whispers are there. So sometimes I will even mix in stories of generations before me, because they, of course, have absolutely no voice. And their whispers will die out eventually. And so I will mix some of their stories in with mine. It's this kind of mashup of things. I know that for others, like when Misty wrote hers with the memoir, she was a little bit more straightforward. But for me, I get to go into the fictional phase of things, and I had to learn that I don't always have to tell the truth in poetry. But I'm able to do settings. I'm able to use a lot of metaphors. Some individuals will accuse us of protecting abusers. That's really not our intent whatsoever. We're actually trying to protect the innocents within the community, and we're trying to also bring awareness. The other thing that we find for those who want to do memoirs, or if you want to do publications, if you start naming names and you start finding incidents and you have no documents to back it up, you're putting yourself in a place to be liable for slander. You could have a lawsuit against you. That's one thing you have to be careful with.
I mean, it's a very nuanced subject. And I just want to finish up with basically, as you said, these are small communities. So, to the general public that reads your stuff or these particular memoirs, they may not have any idea who these people are, but the people in the community know. How do the people you write about, when they can identify themselves, feel about your writing, or other feedback that the memoirs you talked to have had?
So we're pretty used to being the black sheep of the family, unless others have left within our family. We're used to not being fully shunned. Some will be fully shunned, but we're used to always being kind of on the edges. When you are a generational abuse chain breaker, that's the loneliness that goes with it, is that there will be ties cut. You fully understand that. You'll be part of it, but you'll no longer be in the embrace. And then the next generation who you have set free, like my sons, they can do what they want, be who they want. There's nothing on them. Will never quite fully understand the cost. So there's something that we have to recognize when we write, that there's a cost that goes with this. But the cost also for us is the education that happens and trying to be the person we wish would have been there for us. Trying to give voice to individuals who never had voices. There's a sadness that goes with that. Like when I won my grant, I have a very large extended family, but I only had a few individuals who were actually in-laws who congratulated me. Nobody was there at my reading, but it's something then that I hear other people, you hear in the back channels, they come to you and say, thank you. Thank you for speaking out. Thank you for talking. And so we look for our reward, if you want to call it that way, in a very different way than probably a traditional writer does.
Well, thank you so much for talking. This has been a great conversation, and a lot of real nuance and specific examples to go with the book that we're reading right now.
Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that.
Welcome to the Words to Write By podcast. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everybody that we have 2 process groups. They meet every week. Every other week, we have a process group where we're just writers hanging out, having fun, talking about issues. It's really helpful. You can find that on our website. Just go to the link on the website and it'll take you to Meetup. Every other Wednesday from that, we have a writing spree. What makes it a little special is that I start the spree with a very short mini craft discussion or craft lesson from one of the many, many books I have on my shelf. And then I set you free to write for 2 hours. So come check us out. You'll find us on Meetup. You can click on the banner on our website and it'll take you to the process group for you to sign up. And most importantly, they are free.
Also, we show up for the writing sprint, so we actually commit to writing 2 hours that evening as well, which I've found very useful as I'm getting a start on book number 2 of my series.
Yeah. Oh, how is that book going?
Slowly, but it's very hard to switch. I really enjoy editing. I've been really enjoying just fine crafting this wonderful, fantastic first book. And now suddenly I'm back I have to come up with something out of my head to fill the page, and it's hard.
Okay, you already did all this though, right? You did this with the first book.
I know, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I think
Really?
we tell ourselves, well, if I do this once, I'll be able to do it again and again, but it isn't that way. Anyway, I'm looking forward to the next book that we'll be doing. We get done with this book because I'm thinking that's going to help me out with some of the writing. But before that, let's go to Writing the Memoir.
Writing the Memoir. We're getting down to the end. We're down to 3 chapters left, and we're going to be doing 2 today, which means that the next podcast will be tackling the very last chapter.
Yep, giving our feelings about the book as a whole and introducing the next book.
Which is a doozy, let me tell you, and you're going to recognize it, so you better stay tuned.
Well, we're going to hold that off and make them wait for it, but right now.
Yeah, just like tension, in a novel. You don't want to give it all away.
The chapter 10 is Your Memoir and the World. And this one, basically, I wrote down that the message is you can't just write about what you're feeling in a memoir. You've got to write about the real world around you. Did that what you took it to mean?
Yeah, that sums it up pretty good. Essentially taking not just the inner world, but, turning your memoir to the outer world as well.
I thought her quote, "You don't want your narrative to become stranded in the island of your personal life, stranded there with no connection to all the mainland." So we're talking about the mainland in this chapter, which is specifically you need grounding.
She says you ask yourself if the story is grounded in the world beyond your personal life, and to provide clues about the setting of your story and place it in the public world.
She gave a couple reasons for why you need grounding. I think it's kind of obvious, but we can go through them. The first one is that readers need to know where and when they are. And specifically, they need to know the time the story is taking place and the place that's taking place. And in fiction writing, setting the scene is very important. You have to show where the characters are physically. And with memoir, especially when you're talking about the jumping back and jumping forward in time, you really need to know where the memoirist is in their story. Are they 6? Are they 18? Are they yesterday?
Yeah, signposting. That's really, really, really important. So, people know where you are and what you're doing. I kind of took it also as, like you were saying, with that inner world and the outer world. In the memoir, we know that the author is trying to work through their inner world and like their inner feelings about events that have taken place. But it's not just about the inner feelings, right? It's about the things that are surrounding them, which is where all the signposting comes from. And if you're not talking, if you're talking about the external world, it's very important to know the where, not just the why.
Right. Earlier in this book, she was addressing memoirs that just write about the what and explaining that you really have to go deep and figure out the why. You have to show how that's affected. You have to show your inner state. And this is kind of the pulling back, saying, now that you've got that, remember, there is all this outer stuff out here.
Right. There's a theory I used to teach in my reading classes about reading a text from a personal angle, and then from a social angle, and then from a worldwide angle. So the further out you go, it changes the meaning or adds more context to the meaning of a piece. So if you put in the outer world, then you're adding in this extra level that readers can interpret.
Right. And I think the memoirs that everyone knows about, that they're really engaged in, have a lot of outside world stuff, like Wild. I mean, there's the whole Pacific ghost trail there and all that physical stuff around as she's working out all these things inside. And it wouldn't have been the same story if she went through all that sitting in her room.
Right. I actually reread it very recently. I feel like that book does a good job of showing how the external world and a very immediate external world affects somebody's inner world and helps them negotiate the conflict with grief. It was really good, dear listener. Please go read that book.
So all this shows that, the best memoirs do this. They connect the inside world of their memoirs to the outside world, and the readers connect through those things. She talks about how you weave the details of the real world through maybe references to fashion or cultural events or technology or things like that just connect. Like those are all the signposts, the physical signposts, rather than just in time, but also like these events and locations.
Yeah. She says that, using those anchors in the real world or the outside world provides a point of entry for the reader into your story. You put yourself in your reader's shoes. Is there a way in for him, something he recognizes as familiar, from which he can venture into the unfamiliar? So when you're weaving in the external, the point here is to access the interior. So you're kind of giving the reader like a common ground first so that they can enter into your own personal world, which is not common ground. It's like a private symbolism at some point, right? Where you're just like, okay, this is my world. This is what I'm thinking inside my head. How do I convey that to somebody who is not me?
And that's really deep, but sometimes you just need to connect the reader to the everyday world that you live in. Like she had an example from her own memoir, Poetry and Prejudice. And this is a story about her being a lesbian living in a very conservative town, and that isn't something that the reader will naturally understand. And so she gives the example of writing about a classroom and all the kids in the classroom, which even if you aren't a lesbian or have lived in an uncomfortable conservative town, you can pick up on the classroom and the kids in the classroom because that's more universal. And then through a more universal setting, then you can get into her personal experience. So not even as deep as in like into her soul, but like just her daily life in this place that you're not familiar with.
Yeah. Well, just to illustrate, here's a couple of sentences actually that do a good job of that. So she starts with, you're in a classroom. She sets up the scene. That's something that everyone can experience, which is a classroom setting. And she goes, for the next 10 minutes, there was a lot of squirming, writing, balling up of paper, and giggling. A little bit further, she says, the two girls who were sitting up in front whispered to each other until I stared at them when they pouted and looked at their paper, but made it clear they were just waiting till I looked away so they could resume their conversation. Right? You're like, okay, this is like kids being annoying students in a classroom.
Or the way you were back when you were in a classroom.
Right. But the key here is that you recognize this and you can see this clearly. And then she gives the next paragraph, which is the internal dialogue. And so she used the classroom as like kind of a gateway into her internal world. She says, the first thought that came into my head was that if I told them I was a lesbian, I would not be physically safe in the cabin. Whoa. And you realize, oh my God, yeah. Mm-hmm. You're like in this, seems like a safe, mundane, normal place, but then becomes sort of dangerous.
Right. So it's something we're familiar with, this classroom, this town, all this stuff. And then suddenly we twist it from her perspective where she would not feel safe.
Right. And if she had said instead, if she had started instead with not with the external, but said, I was teaching in this conservative town with these kids who seemed somewhat normal, but if I had told them I was a lesbian, I knew I wouldn't feel safe. It's like, okay, well, why? I don't get it. But when you tailor it like this, it's like, oh, I can kind of see that now.
Mm-hmm. Or you're giving authenticity. You say, oh, look, she's describing a classroom as the way classrooms are. She's describing a school, a location, all this real world detail that is totally believable. So now when she talks about this thing that maybe isn't familiar to me, I can believe her because she's already given evidence that this is grounded in the real world.
Yeah.
It's always about authenticity.
Yeah. But it's interesting because do people think about authenticity much when they're writing? I've been reading a couple of memoirs, and I actually have rolled my eyes a few times of the things that people have said in their memoirs because I don't believe them.
Well, the people sound inauthentic when either A, they're making stuff up and they don't really know what's going on, or B, they're so familiar with this stuff that they don't see any reason to explain it to anybody else.
So they probably didn't anchor it in the real world enough.
Right. They didn't step back and say, how would this look? Because in a way, when you're being completely and utterly authentic, you might have no idea that somebody wouldn't understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
So do you think those memoirs you're reading, they just were so into themselves, they just didn't understand that someone wouldn't believe them?
I think that, so it's horrible because I guess maybe I'm projecting into them and that's wrong. And obviously I want to give them like the benefit of the doubt and not just like say, they suck. But I was reading Janet McCurdy, I think her name is. She was a child actress.
Oh, I'm glad my mom's dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere right now, right? And I thought, okay, well, maybe this will be interesting. I've never read a memoir from an actress before, especially a child actress. This might be interesting.
So what detail did you feel was like not believable?
Okay, so she says, so she was writing about being a child and she was trying to illustrate showing signs of OCD. Dealing with the stress of her mother and having to, do these auditions she didn't really want to do as a kid. But she was also Mormon. So she said, one day the Holy Ghost started talking to me. She explains that I guess the Holy Ghost is something that talks to you as a Mormon. It's not God, but it's like that voice, like Jiminy Cricket, I guess. One day the Holy Ghost started talking to me, telling me to go to the bathroom and lock and unlock the doors. And I'm in my head like, I don't believe that. I don't believe you had a voice in your head telling you to do these things. I think that it came out in a different way. It just felt too literal. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe somebody was coaching her to tell her, well, there has to be a reason. How did you know you had OCD? How did this manifest? I feel like she had to come up with something somewhat plausible to explain this. But I wasn't buying it. It didn't feel authentic. And there were plenty of places, actually this happened over and over again throughout her book, where I was just like, I don't know if I believe that. Maybe it's true or not, but however she put it out there, it didn't feel believable. It felt like it was just being set up so it could be delivered to me.
Well, she is a performer, so there is a certain amount of that and a certain amount of packaging stuff and presenting stuff.
Well, there's a big difference between being an actor and being a writer. I mean, they're very different.
Right, but she's actually had experience doing the writing as well. I think later in her career, didn't she do more writing and such?
Maybe that's what she's trying to do now, change her career a bit and not twerk on stage like Miley Cyrus. I don't know. I think her writing is less to be desired, but you're not reading that book for her writing. You're reading it because you want to know what it was like to be a child actress.
Yeah.
Actually, do we say actress anymore, or is it just actor all across the board now?
I have no idea. I will say that since my next book comes from the perspective of the band member that was a child actor or a child performer, that I was definitely reading all the details about what it was like to be a small child in Hollywood.
Which one did you read? Which ones?
Well, no, in her book, McCarthy's book.
Oh, you read it?
I read the first part of it. I haven't gotten as far as that. But no, so I was reading it specifically for the information of like what it was like to be auditioning and a child in these situations and what they did with the kids when they weren't performing or were performing in the...
So since you weren't reading it for a craft, you were reading it for like content and like, seeing how your own character would go through life. Did you catch any authenticity?
No, it seemed about right. I mean, like I said, I didn't go as deep into like her later stuff. I need to get into when she was actually in the Disney shows or whatever.
This was in the first part of the book.
Right. I got to the part where she was discussing when she was still like just one of the many children that was brought in for extras for parts.
Oh, that's the super beginning.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you might get to the part that I was talking about, but it's not just that. There's a lot of things in there that don't feel authentic. Now, they probably are, which is really sad because I'm like, oh man, she wasn't able to like deliver it in an authentic way. Because I don't want to say, oh, this didn't happen to her. Maybe it did. I felt like she was getting cues from somebody to answer questions. Like someone had, read her draft, been like, you need to answer these questions. And she had to put things in there in order to justify them.
To go back to the Barrington thing, she does comment on how when we are kids, we aren't necessarily aware of all the real world that's happening around us. And that For writing a memoir, though, you can't be that oblivious child when you're writing about that part of your life. You have to bring in the other stuff. She says, readers know that children can be oblivious to such things, but are unlikely to warm to an adult narrator who writes with the child's limited vision. So maybe that's why she had that other stuff in there, because she wanted to show not just that she was herself in her head being OCD, but like actually, this is what drove her to it.
You know what? If she had did a perhapsing.
I was thinking that. You always do perhapsing in your stuff.
Yeah.
Your memoir's a lot of perhapsing as you try to dig down. And she was not that way.
She was not doing that. She was saying it as if this is really happening as a kid and this is what she was thinking. I bet that's what is causing it. Interesting. Okay.
Whenever you're an expert or whenever you've done something enough that you really know how it's done and you see someone doing it differently, it pings.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's great. I mean, I feel actually really bad saying bad things because it's like, she's published. She's written this book. A lot of people read it and I'm poo-pooing on it. Obviously, what do I know? I'm just giving my personal opinion on.
And I do believe that having her mother was very rough growing up.
Oh, no, don't doubt. I mean, I don't doubt all those things happening to her. It's just some of her writing didn't come out authentically. Not to say it wasn't authentic.
Do you want any other comments about this chapter?
She does have this gray box, another gray box.
Yeah.
Where she discusses this inner dialogue. I can see that being an issue. I mean, I remember like when I first started writing or like, when you start first writing novels, I can see people being like, and I thought this and I thought that. And it's like, well, you don't have to say I thought. Right. It doesn't go into that, but this idea that as the writer, the things that are going on in your head have to be displayed on the page. And those things are your inner dialogue. I don't know. She defined it. I think it was helpful, I guess. She says it's when you tell how you perceive something or feel about it, when you speculate to yourself. See, speculate, perhapsing. When you speculate to yourself about what happened or play out in your mind how you wish it had gone, the reader experiences it as overhearing your thoughts, or perhaps as a dialogue with them personally. And I was reading this really popular series, A Court of Crown and something.
Oh my God, you were reading that series?
I tried. I had to return it back to the library. It was awful. It was so bad. And this inner dialogue, so this main character, I'm like, oh my God. I was gardening. I couldn't really stop listening. I was actually listening to this book. And I was like, oh, this is so bad. The main character, all they were doing was talking about how they need to escape this like fairy.
Yeah.
But she wouldn't stop.
This hot fairy.
I got this. There was a lot of sexual tension going on and this Beauty and the Beast stuff. And it was like, I'm going to escape. Oh, I'm going to try to escape here. I'm going to try to escape here. She didn't actually move or do anything. And I'm like, can you like stop talking about that and move on to something else? Because you've spent a lot of pages on this and now I'm going to return this book. Did you start reading it?
Oh, yes.
Did you finish it?
So I found a website where a woman does a reading of those really popular fantasy romance books that are actually really bad that she calls the Jealous Haters Club.
Haters Club. That's awesome.
We'll put a link for it on the show notes. And she went through the book chapter by chapter and dissed all that stuff all the way through.
So it wasn't just me.
No.
Oh, God. Oh. Well, so my hairdresser suggested it to me. And I was like, oh, fantasy. I like fantasy books. Oh, female main character. Oh, this is bad. But it's popular.
It is so popular.
So is it kind of like that craze that was the vampire?
Is Twilight Levels popular?
Really?
Yep.
Wow. Okay. So this is going the same as Hunger Games and Twilight. It's going to have its own show now. Huh?
Yeah. I've heard that it's been through like yes and no. It's kind of, I'm not sure what the status of it is, but yes, it is extremely popular and it is unfortunately.
Teenage girls.
Yeah. And women that want to be teenage girls. I'm not sure. I bet.
Oh.
I mean, I have to admit, I looked at it and a lot of the stuff where I have Sufi completely crushing out. It's like in my back of my mind, how did they do it in Court of Thrones and whatever?
Oh my God, that's
and
funny.
how can I make it actually fun?
Yeah, right. Readable.
Yes.
How to make it readable and not cringy. Oh, man. Oh, I was reading another memoir that was so bad. I was actually getting stuff out of it, though. Everything was very transparent because it was so bad.
The people that do it best hide all the background stuff they're doing, all the structural stuff, all that you don't even pay attention to. You're just so absorbed. But some doesn't do it well balanced. It's like, oh, yep, and there's that element there, and there's that element there, and now we're doing the supposing and all that.
Which is to say, I think it's a good thing to read bad writing sometimes, because the good writers hide the stuff they're doing so well you can't see it. You're just absorbed, like you said. But if you read the bad stuff, at least you can kind of see what they're doing.
Right. The reason why I was enjoying, I had someone else kind of holding my hand while I was going through what the plot of this book was, because like there are all the tropes that I absolutely hate, but I wanted to see how they played out. And it was like, yep, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Anyway, so.
Actually, this is a good conversation. This really breaks it down. Yeah.
So the last thing I want to do with this chapter is she's got this figure in the back on the last page of the chapter, and it's got this concentric circles. In the very beginning, you have inner life, and then you've got the next circle is intimate family relationships, and then beyond that, school, neighborhood, friends. And then the next ring is work, subcultures, communities, acquaintances. Further out, we've got mass culture, country, strangers, and the final one is the world.
The world.
And you need to be in kind of all these places to an extent in your memoir to make it authentic and believable and really, really fit. But what I liked about it is there's a little pie cut out of it, which says your memoir. Because while there is the whole big world, or there is the mass culture or the school or all that, not every aspect of those worlds or those elements need to be in your memoir. The memoir is what's actually directly linked back to this kind of pie that cuts back to your inner life. And I liked the line, looking outward at the world that impinges upon your story does not require you to look sideways at a bigger slice of your experience. So when you're figuring out how to bring bigger parts of the world into your memoir, you're looking for those elements. Don't just go grabbing something random that isn't necessarily connected to what your memoir is about, simply to have a place in the story, or to simply place the story. It all links back and forth into this interior life and this story that you're telling.
Yeah. Reading some memoirs recently, I've been noticing like craft things that were invisible to me that have now become very visible. And I don't know if it's this book or not that's doing it, but I've been noticing how the authors are picking and choosing their details very carefully. Mm-hmm. Are they going to bring in this conversation with a friend? I'm reading Ages for Hawk right now. The author talks a lot about T.S. White, who wrote The Once and Future King. And she's using that kind of as her anchor, her point to jump off of to talk about her own hawk, because I guess he raised a hawk too. It's interesting how she really picks very, very specific details that only serve the points she's trying to make. Mm-hmm. But that's it. She's probably only talked about her childhood 3 times, but they were very carefully selected details. And then she spends pages upon pages talking about T.S. White. But those are also very carefully chosen.
Mm-hmm. What I like about this book overall is that often she'll give these expansive, inspiring kind of passages and all that, but then she'll also link back to say, but what your memoir actually needs is these things to keep in mind. It's a matter of writing your various ideas, but then pruning them and making sure they fit the memoir. That they fit the story, that they're tight as well.
Pruning. I like that.
So I would say that your memoir in the world, while it wasn't necessarily super bullet pointy how to do it, had some good information. It was good to return to from the point of the book. We've been getting all these reflection and jumping around in time and all this stuff. And this is kind of a good, here's how you combine this inner introspection with the bigger world to make a strong memoir. And then she's got this chapter called Watch Out for the Myths.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this one?
It was a little weird. I don't know if it needed to be said.
Yes. This is one of those self-care chapters.
Uh-huh.
Like, when you're writing your memoir, keep these things in mind so you don't go off the rails personally with your life.
Right. I mean, she specifically just talks about there's this idea of the memoirist or this idea of the writer being like this tragic, sad figure and not to do it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mom.
I found 4 myths. This is one of those situations where bullet points really would be nice, or little subheadings, like so I can see what all 4 myths were. I had to dig in a little bit. First myth was that memoirs are all famous, or they are close to famous people.
My mom thought that. She was mad that I was writing a memoir. And then she says, it's not like you're famous or anything.
This is good advice for someone writing a memoir, because you're going to be telling people you're going to write their memoir, and you're going to get these blank looks because you're not famous.
Right.
Then the counteract is if once they accept that you aren't famous and you're writing a memoir, they assume you're a narcissist.
Yes, my mom thought that too. Maybe she is right. I don't know.
It is interesting. This is playing out very well with your own personal experiences. So
I
suppose this is a good chapter to let the memoirists know what they're up for as they start publicly saying they're writing a memoir.
That's true.
The next one was that you're referring to the tragic, lonely, depressed, alcoholic writer.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Very Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson style.
Mm-hmm. And also like certain writers that she has run into that basically were modeling their lifestyles after that stereotype.
Right. I mean, is this stereotype still a thing? Have people like kind of wizened up, or are people still kind of like attracted to this dark hero of the writer?
Definitely readers are attracted to it. I mean, that's the thing, is that it shows up in fiction all the bloody time.
The tragic writer?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Or the wannabe tragic writer. That's kind of pathetic.
You mean the authors or they have characters that do this?
They have characters in books that are, books and movies often portray writers that way, or the shut-in, or, that very romantic type of writer, which...
Both self-loathing yet destructive at the same time.
Yeah.
The drinker and the drug abuser and yeah.
As a writer, I think that's the first thing we recognize is that's not how it is, because it takes too much damn work to sit there drinking and being depressed. You're never going to get anything written that way.
Right. It takes a while for it to come out as a myth. This comes across as kind of like, if you are drinking because you have the voices in your head telling you you're not good and all these other things, the drinking, I don't think, is actually stopping that.
Well, not only that, but if you are emulating some great writer that you read about drinking, like Hemingway apparently drank a lot. You read the stories about famous writers and they've got these wildish tales about all the things that they got into. The fact was that at a certain point, they were able to put away the alcohol or whatever enough to actually get the writing done, because writing requires mental alertness and focus and an overall positive attitude.
Right. And you get the illusion that, when you're drunk and you write something, it's coming out great. When you read it the next day, it is not great. Mm-hmm. A note about Hemingway. So, yes, he was a severe alcoholic. And in the end of his life, part of the reason he killed himself was, I guess, the drinking, I think, caught up with him. I think he was having some dementia issues because he couldn't write anymore. He kept trying to write, and he couldn't come up with any more ideas, or he couldn't get into that writing mode. And he kept trying and couldn't do it. And he started even trying to retype his old stories. He was like copying his old work, trying to get back into that frame of mind, and he couldn't. And soon after, he shot himself. Mm-hmm. Did he need the alcohol that whole time to write those stories? I really don't think so. Maybe he told himself he did, but he didn't.
So some of these are myths that you shouldn't let yourself fall into. The other one that you shouldn't let yourself fall into, she said, is the envious, jealous, neurotic writer that's, constantly agonizing about how successful everybody else around them are and how unappreciated they are. And here she actually gave a little dig at Anne Lamott.
She did. Anne Lamott made a cameo.
Yeah, she said that some writers mythologize their pervasive insecurities falling under the spell of their own eloquence to make our fears seem both humorous and somehow appealing. In her book on writing, Bird by Bird, Anne Lamott is just one of many who writes in this vein about the agony of sending off a manuscript. Finally, if you're lucky enough, a week later you get a note from your agent's assistant that the manuscript has in fact arrived, and maybe one of the friends has called to say that he or she has read your part. So anyways, you can go back to our various Anne Lamott episodes and you can hear all this. And largely she did it to be funny and to connect with the readers. But Barrington basically says it's all good and well, but don't actually be serious about that stuff.
Right. You know, Anne Lamott has that self-deprecating humor, right? Barrington does not.
Yeah, and Barrington says, just don't even go down that way. It's just better to push that aside, have healthy relationships, have a healthy environment, have a positive attitude, and feel good for your friends who are writers.
Yeah, she says that competitiveness and envy, like anxiety about rejection, undoubtedly exist to some degree about writers, but I am disturbed by the pieces of writing, such as Bonnie Friedman's Envy, the writer's disease. She says it is all too easy to become focused on the injustices or the simple stupidities that surround the world of publishing, grants, literary prizes, and so on, but that when I do, I quickly lose my ability to write.
I don't know if I've plugged one of the fun reads I had recently, but Yellowface.
Oh, was that good?
By Kwan. Oh, yeah. Seriously good. All the other things aside, it is looking at all the Twitter drama and all the anxiety that a successfully published writer, whatever the background of her why she got published, goes through, and how she absolutely undoes herself because she gets so obsessed by what people are thinking about her that she never actually even appreciates the fame that she actually gets. But it's a good one, and it's definitely a cautionary tale of what not to be if you ever get a 6-figure book contract.
But it's not a memoir. It's a novel, right?
No, it's totally fictionalized.
Okay, I should read it.
Oh, yeah, good. It's really fun. Here's one thing I have with this chapter, which is that a fiction writer can write truly horrific things and have a completely blah and boring life. Like I've heard things that, Stephen King is like this happy, contented guy who's got everything going, and then for his 8 hours a day or whatever, he sits down and writes these horrific stuff, and then he puts it away, and everything else is good. And a fiction writer can do that, but a memoir is actually writing from their own life. And I wrote down here that most memoirs have something shitty that's happened to them, and they've struggled to get over that, and they write their memoir about that. And to imply that you have something horrible happen to you, you process, you go through it, and then you are in a completely happy, contented place to write about this thing that happened to you, but now you're just fine, seems like a pretty hard level to get to.
I mean, I don't think they end with and everything was awesome.
Right, but the thing is that she's implying that, you yourself as a person should be in that everything is really good and content, good place. When in fact, the people that are likely to write a memoir are people who have had an experience that has been very life-changing or, has had difficulties and they've had to process, they've got all this complicated stuff. And to imply that, no, you can be perfectly happy and normal and boring, but still have this amazing story to tell, it's kind of hard. Because maybe part of their story was that you were an alcoholic, or part of the story was that you drove your friends away because you were neurotic about something.
Right. It's that whole distance, right? You've got the distance from the experience itself. So you're in a better place. But the writing of it, I will say, is very hard. It is easy to drink when, you're trying not to wallow in stuff and you just want to write about things. And at first it seems to help you gain a bit of distance. You're like, there's the distance. I can talk about it, whatever. But it will eventually start to eat into your productivity. You won't write at all. So I don't know. Yes. In order to write probably an effective memoir, you have to have both figured things out and also gotten beyond a few things. Mm-hmm. In order for it to not sound like pity, or not get pity from people, or, does it sound like a revenge memoir?
But what I'm saying is that in order to have the material to write a memoir, probably you've gone through some stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, there needs to be conflict or no one will read it. Sorry.
Right. But which means it feels a little bit trite for her to say, well, don't do that anymore, given it's like, there's one set of life advice you give to just a general population. And there's another one that you do if you're in the cancer ward of or if you're in a trauma center or whatever. Like at that point, you're like, let's step back here and not just say, oh yes, you don't have to have any substance abuse, you don't have to be depressed, you don't have to be anxious. You're just in a just have good, happy, healthy relationships. Despite the fact that you're writing this memoir about this horrible stuff that happened to you.
Your chances of being in that place are pretty slim. It would have been a good point for her to make. Like, offer a solution.
Right.
Instead of saying, just don't drink, girls and boys, just say no to that, image of the writer. She could have said, therapy is really helpful.
But I think that's an entire book, not a chapter at the very end of this.
Right, but she could have thrown that in there. She'd be like, do you have like a therapist you could talk to? That's a lot. In the end, that's cheaper than alcoholism.
Actually, what I think would have been really good is for her to have brought in her own experiences. Because one of the reasons she wrote the book was because her parents died suddenly and she was left adrift. And this was a really rough stage of her life. And she wrote about that. But the person that's writing about that has experienced that kind of event. So maybe it would have been a good place to bring in her own experience and say, how could she have been this person that had suffered from these various elements, but now be in a very good and happy place now? How her own experiences could be an example for somebody that is writing a memoir about rough times in their lives while trying to also cultivate a healthy lifestyle in their current life.
That'd be a great book. I'd read that. How to write about trauma. Not how to write about it as in craft, but how to tackle it without becoming an alcoholic.
Anyway, so that's what my thought of this chapter was.
Okay. Well, and that, dear listener, is really that. There isn't much more. We got one more chapter, but that was Watch Out for the Myths.
So, writing exercise. Actually, this sounds like a fun writing exercise. This is from the chapter 10, and it is, think of an event of historic or cultural importance that you remember: the assassination of President Kennedy, the first moon landing, the end of the Berlin Wall, John Lennon's deaths, an outstanding sporting event, the March on Washington, the Roe versus Wade decision, the AIDS epidemic, the Gulf War, etc. All of which is older than me, and I don't personally remember, but I think we can come up with some more recent events. When she was doing the edits, she really should have included something a little more recent there. Anyway, write personally about how you witnessed or heard about that event and how it impacted you.
Okay.
That's what we're going to go away and do. And the next part of the show, we will discuss our writing exercise. And we're back.
And we have an activity to share with you.
Yes, we have Renee's because I haven't done mine yet. That will be done before next week's podcast, which will be a workshop podcast, and that'll be my piece.
Yeah, it'll be a bit longer. But this one, I've had to cut it down. Kim told me I kept having to cut it down.
Well, the assignment was, you said the assignment was 3 to 4 pages, and you did that. And then I said, yep, just pick the best part now.
But the best parts are what I have to cut. No. I don't know. I'm always worried I did the assignment wrong, but we're going to find out. So here it is. Usually I was alone in Dad's living room, curled up on his Easy Boy lounger, sneaking drags off his discarded cigarette butts while watching Clarissa Explains It All, while Dad browsed for porn chats on IRC in his bedroom. But today, Dad had insisted on watching the news, which meant I had to sit on the orange velour upholstered rocking chair Grandma picked up from Goodwill or a garage sale or off the side of the road. Dad took a drag off his Camel and stuffed the butt into his overflowing ashtray. A puff of ash caught the light, and a line of smoke continued to flow to the ceiling. The Cold War has ended, the news anchor lady said, like she was proud of something, like she had ended the war all by herself. The image beside the woman's face featured 2 old men positioned side by side. I recognized one as President Bush and the other by his birthmark, the leader of the USSR, whom I could differentiate from all of the other white old men on the news because he had a large birthmark on his head. More old men shaking hands flashed on the screen, old footage of people tearing down the Berlin Wall just a couple of years prior, more news anchors dropping names like Reagan and Kennedy, all in that elated voice. The Cold War is over, they kept saying. The Cold War. Had a whole war taken place and I wasn't even aware of it? I was only 11 years old, but the people who fought in wars curated the backdrop of my life and spoke of them often. My 11-year-old brain stored mental movies of Dad getting shot on boats in Vietnam, skimming across rivers, bullets spewing from the bushes along the shore. My imagination had already conjured tropical islands from World War II, in which atomic bombs were dropped and a grandpa relaxed on a beach a day later. And yet, a whole war I'd never heard of had taken place while I was alive, supposedly in my own country, without me even knowing. Dad, I asked, what's the Cold War?
The moment the question left my throat, I regretted it. I knew better than to ask Dad questions, but I was impulsive and forgot too easily. I braced the armrests on my chair. Shit, Renee, you don't know what the fucking Cold War is? He yelled, his face animated, turning red. What the hell are they teaching you in school? How could you not know about the whole fucking war? I stared ahead and gripped the arms of my chair until all I heard was just a loud, drawn-out noise, a wave of expletives exploding from a few feet away. Deep inside, I waited for him to finish while curating a hatred for this man who would yell at me well into my adulthood. When Dad wasn't around, Grandpa would say, Mike was never the same since he came back from Vietnam. But Dad was only 17 when he had enlisted and came back just 8 months later. I did not know the person Grandpa knew, who apparently existed but was already gone before I was born. It's hard to know a dad who was once a person who didn't scream, hurry up, move, 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 when I dallied on the way to his truck, or God damn it, Renee, for forgetting my jacket at the restaurant again. I'd only known and would ever know a dad who lectured me like a machine gun. He finally calmed down, his performance over. The news droned on. Dad lit another cigarette. This is how it was, a loud barrage, then an awed quiet, the universe aligning the chaos to order, to normal again. Just enough time to grow bored and forget what I had just learned. Dad, did you shoot anyone in Vietnam? I don't know where that question came from. It just came out of my mouth. And to my surprise, Dad didn't react quickly like he did when he was about to yell. I looked at him and saw surprise. Something was going on behind those eyes, but I couldn't tell what. Something new. Confusion? Composure? Renee, honey, I shot at the bushes that shot at me.
That was awesome.
Yay!
I think I'd heard a little bit of I heard the, shot at the bushes that shot at me.
Yeah.
Before, but that was really nice. I liked it a lot.
I had to cut out so much good stuff.
You know what? I think after this, you should take a look at what was there before and what got cut out, and not right away, but like maybe in a week or two, and then see if you think that it benefited from the cutting or if the other one was originally the best. Because I just thought that was so nice and tight. I loved how you jumped around in time and the signposting. That was great. Yeah, you really worked in that moment on the TV screen with your interactions with your father, going forward and backwards, and that she really cut that slice of the circles that Barrington talks about or shows in the book.
The circles with the world and the people and society and then yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You think Barrington would give me a good grade?
She would read your piece aloud to class and say, this is an example of what I'm talking about.
So I'm getting images of that scene from A Christmas Story where the teacher's like writing A plus on the screen. You know what I'm talking about?
No, I've never seen that
No?
one. I know I should see it at some point.
You've never? Oh my God. Okay. Well, this next Christmas, I know what we're doing.
Okay. So what made you choose this piece? What was in your mind before you started writing this piece?
Well, we read the prompt and I was like, well, historical. What went on in a relative time of peace in my life growing up? And I was like, oh, well, the Cold War. I've actually tried to write this scene many, many times over many, many years. Like trying to get it right, trying to figure out like why I'm writing about it besides it just being interesting and an interesting thing my dad had said. Also that he's yelling at me all the time. And this whole thing played out. And I just kept trying to capture it. And I guess I finally did with this prompt.
Do you think there was some aspect of the prompt or more just like you had to approach it one more time and this is the time it clicked?
I think it clicked partly because, we keep bringing them up, but Bickham is really helpful. Because I would write scenes, but I wouldn't like extrapolate in between and know what to put in the middle. And there's that. But then with Barrington, she talked about the now that we had covered before, where you kind of anchor yourself in a now. And then I was like, oh, so that's how you're slipping in as the adult, especially in like if you're writing about a kid's experience as yourself as a kid. This is how you slip in is there's an assumed now and I assumed a now. And so that like kind of gave me access into figuring out how to draw out the scene. That and I've been reading a lot of memoirs lately, not necessarily good ones. And we were talking about that earlier, where it's like suddenly the things just pop out. Or I don't know, maybe it's all just coalescing over the years. Like I'm finally noticing things I didn't notice before.
The Bickham stuff really, I mean, you had a really good cause and effect. Like you would say something, your dad would say something, it all played together really well. It really unfolded. And although it had two very different elements, the whole seeing the thing on the TV set, but then through your internal thoughts, it made perfect sense why you suddenly asked about the Vietnam War and your father. But also it showed why he was completely confused where that came from.
Oh, interesting. I actually hadn't thought of that.
Mm-hmm.
I did make the connection in my head, but it wasn't clear to him. So yeah, I guess I stumped him for a second.
Part of the idea here of having a particular event is it brings the reader in with something they're familiar with. I will say one thing that really clicked in my mind was when you mentioned Gorbachev's birthmark. You introduced him first with the birthmark. I was like, yes, I remember that person. I remember the images of the two leaders, world leaders next to each other. I actually I don't know if it's a real memory, but part of me kind of remembers some sort of interaction between them and officially the Cold War was over. But the birthmark was like, it just clicked him into my mind. And so even though you were in a very different location than I was around that time period, I could see where you were, partly from that image.
Yeah, I didn't actually think about that as like anchoring people and like who this guy was, because that really just was the way I knew who this guy was. I think that's cool that other people were like, oh, it's the birthmark guy. I know who that is. Especially if you're a kid, right?
Yes, definitely. Although it was a very distinctive birthmark.
Yeah. I actually just looked at pictures of him when he was young and he had hair. And it was like, oh, at some point people couldn't use that because it was covered up.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I guess when he lost his hair, I don't know. Anyway, also it was so weird writing the word or the acronym USSR. I was like, oh, it's been a while since I thought of that. Wow.
It's also interesting because one of the reasons why we often choose to write about events, major world events that happened when we were kids, is because before that world event, sometimes we're completely oblivious to the fact that it exists. So like for you and the Cold War, like that was the moment you learned about the Cold War. It wasn't just, this historical moment, but this moment you became aware of it, where you had never considered it before. I'm sure if I go back to some of the events in my life, like as a kid, it's like, I remember when Reagan was elected, I was not aware of that we had a president until Reagan was elected and I was in kindergarten. And suddenly, like I saw articles and it was in my mind, oh, we have a president.
You have a leader and this is it.
Kids just aren't, I mean, adults are this way too, but not as much. But kids are just legitimately aren't aware of a lot of the world until some event it happens and someone says, oh, look at this. And it's like, oh, that's why.
That chapter, it would talk a bit about like why we're supposed to include the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the reasons was that it brings the reader in to something they know, to be introduced to a world that's different than them. It gives you a certain amount of authenticity, like, yep, this event was happening. It grounded us in time. Like it made sense why you as a kid would be learning about the Cold War and your father would have fought in Vietnam. The timeline works out.
So that was enough. That was enough for a reader to be able to like orient themselves in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. So I guess it's a win. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you got this version of the story done. It'll be quite interesting if it makes it to your memoir this way. Is it going to be part of the memoir?
I've splintered the memoir so much that it's like, well, how much am I going to include about Dad? And he is quite a character. I could write a whole book about him. So it depends on how it's going to serve the story. If it ends up in the book, it's either going to end up in a chapter where I talk about when I was living with some people, some guys I was friends with when I was younger, who constantly talked about the Cold War and fear of nuclear weapons. And they weren't that much older than me, but they were old enough. Like they were about like 8-9 years older than I was. And so they grew up with kind of like this fear that, the bomb could drop it, but they also kind of wanted it to drop. They're like Red Dawn, like fans of Red Dawn or whatever. And so I had a hard time kind of understanding it because I'm like, well, I was alive while you guys were saying that these bombs were going to drop, but really wasn't occurring to me at the time. But I was so much younger, I wasn't aware. that any of that had anything to do with me or that was taking place. So either I'm going to put that story in as a way to like contextualize like how I'm not really identifying with these guys in the sense that I don't understand what they're so afraid of, but yet I am aware of stuff. So it's not like I'm completely daft and not aware of my world. Or it's going to be folded into a chapter just, about me growing up and living with dad or being with dad and what he was like, and probably explains why I'm a little touched.
I think it's better with the chapter about your dad because it's just such a strong interaction and such a strong moment that I don't think it should be squeezed in to a story that's like just to help understand why you don't understand something.
Okay. So I'm writing a story about my mom. Do you think it's even necessary to bring up dad? I mean, he is kind of there. I don't know.
I mean, it's your story. You'll, like you said, you'll see if it fits. And if your father gets a chapter, this would probably fit really well in that chapter.
All right, dear listener, I hope you had a good time.
Yeah. And that's just a reminder that we have our Wednesday process groups, either a writing sprint or a writers get together and talk about stuff. We would love to have you join us. It's on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
Yep. Hope to see you there.
Thanks so much. You guys take care. Bye.
Bye.
Words to Write By is produced by Renee Nelson and Kim Smiga Adam. Our theme music is Roll Back the Carpet by Cool Cat Music. Have a great day.
Probably cut this out, but when I first started smoking,